You're listening to the World Soccer Talk podcast, the only podcast about watching soccer on TV and online. Welcome to episode 157. Coming up on this week's show, CBS lands NWSL TV and streaming rights, what the CAS ruling about promotion relegation means for US soccer, Premier League viewing numbers increase but quality drops, plus we have letters from you, the listeners, in our mailbag section. I'm Christopher Harris, aka The Gaffer, and I'm joined, as always, by my co-host, Kartik Krishnaiyer. Kartik, so for those listeners who haven't heard the show before, we talk about the commentators, the production value, the latest television developments that are changing the way that you watch soccer, as well as which are the best streaming services to watch the beautiful game. And there's a lot of news to dive into, but before we get into that, Kartik, let's go ahead and start off with what was your favourite match from this past week?
Boy, I guess it would have to be Red Bull Leipzig, or RB Leipzig, excuse me, and Borussia Mönchengladbach. We know what the RB stands for, right, in reality, although they've tried to cover that. But RB Leipzig and Borussia Mönchengladbach, a match between two of the top four in the Bundesliga. For those who don't follow the Bundesliga, the league is separated, the top four, by only 3 points after this match. This match was at Leipzig. Gladbach got out to a 2-goal lead at halftime. Leipzig coming off a loss. Bayern had just passed them in the table a matter of a half an hour or an hour before, and Dortmund kept up the pressure with another masterclass from Sancho and Haaland in the morning. So, or morning our time, but just in the kickoffs right before this kickoff. So, Leipzig had to come from behind. They got the draw late on. Mönchengladbach reduced to 10 men, almost saw the match out. It was a lot of back and forth. Gladbach sat deep after they were reduced to 10 men, but still at times tried to pick spots to go forward. So this was a fun match. This was on FS2 alongside a match on NBC, which I understand was quite dour, which was the Wolves Man United match. So I think I made the right choice switching to FS2 at that time.
Dower is being kind, Kartik. The Manchester United against Wolves with a 0-0 draw, it was just absolutely dreadful. Really, really poor. Lacking any creativity, really, from Manchester United. Wolves, I expected more. I just don't know if the players are getting tired from playing all the Europa League action and just a busy Christmas schedule for everyone too. But and Wolves have so many times this season come close to beating the big clubs. Whether they're playing Liverpool or Man United or Man City, been putting in some really, really good performances. But this match was absolutely dreadful, which was followed on Sunday morning too by Arsenal against Burnley. Another really dreadful 0-0 match, just again lacking creativity. And it made me wonder, Kartik, and that's the thing, though, too. The Man United-Wolves game had over 1 million viewers on NBC and Universo combined. So the viewership is still tuning in to watch the Premier League, whether you're a Wolves fan, Man United fan, or a neutral. But it made me wonder this past weekend, what would have to happen in order for... the Premier League's my favourite league of all the leagues around the world, for sure, by a huge margin. But what would it take me to stop watching the Premier League? And I guess in some ways it's already started, because I'm definitely watching a lot more leagues, and even when there's a Premier League match on, I'm more likely now than ever before to go ahead and actually watch a game from a different league, or it doesn't have to be league. It could be just even two other teams that are of interest to me that are not in the Premier League. And it just made me wonder what it would take. But I always first gravitate towards the Premier League area. That's my honest opinion. But oftentimes lately, probably in the last couple of years, I've been thinking, okay, well, is this really going to be a good match, or should I actually watch the other one? And I made the mistake in this one, watching Man United against Wolves, sticking it through all the way into the end and missing the RB Leipzig Gladbach game. What about you, Kartik? Have your tastes changed?
Yeah, the Premier League has been very difficult to watch this year, and honestly, if I weren't playing fantasy Premier League, this is where fantasy sports comes into account. I think with a lot of people's preferences and why they like. I mean, I don't watch American sports that closely, but why I have to assume they like the NFL so much is partly because a lot of people play fantasy football, fantasy American football. But if I weren't playing fantasy, and if NBC's coverage wasn't so good, and I wasn't so committed to kind of the branding and the quality of analysis NBC gives, I'd probably be watching even less of it than I am. I think, to me, there's an awful lot of mediocrity. There's an awful lot of matches which just make my head would scratch my head. And look, and this is all cyclical, okay? I think what we found is 10 years ago, the Premier League, in my opinion, was head and shoulders the best league in the world, even though some people would argue differently, that only the top four were really, really good, top four, top six, whatever. Then I think we went into a cycle where Spain was better, was a deeper league, but the Premier League was in many ways more compelling because you had greater variety of teams that were able to finish in that position from maybe 6 to 10 than you had in the Spanish league. It was consistently the same teams, although I would say the team that finishes fourth in Spain would kind of change from year to year. One year would be Valencia, and the next year would be Villarreal. It was Malaga one year. So that would change. But then we went into a cycle, and I started complaining about this a couple of years ago, Chris, where I thought the Premier League, the top – after the amazing year where Leicester won the title, Southampton finished in the top six, and West Ham were very good and were probably unlucky in a couple of games to not push into that top five, top four even. The Premier League, it's almost like the Empire Strikes Back, right? The top clubs, the gap between sixth and seventh got wider and wider, and I started to complain about that when we relaunched this podcast in this format. In the 16-17 season, that the football wasn't as good as it had been from top to bottom. There weren't these exciting open Premier League games that you used to have. You didn't have the teams like that Fulham that would go after it. West Ham for years. West Ham was always a side, even when they struggled with relegation, that had a certain ethos to how they played. And now you had more and more teams parking the bus because of the financial disparity. That's just gotten worse and worse. So the last 3 seasons, you had a team that won the league with 100 points. That was a record. The next season, you had 2 teams finish above 96 points, which had been the previous record for the Premier League. That had been Chelsea's team under Jose in the first stint. I believe the second season, right, 05-06 season, that Chelsea got to that point total. And then this year you have a team that might get 110 points or 108 points, win the league. So you cannot tell me the league is more competitive and the greatest show on earth when just the facts kind of refute that. And then you have in some of your classic teams that you would want to watch a lot, like Arsenal. Fans complained about Wenger, he wasn't winning anything, but you would still tune in to watch an Arsenal game because of the style of play, the quality of the passing and the movement from Arsenal Football Club. And Arsenal, even in the period they were not winning trophies, were attracting a lot of new fans across the globe, not just because of their marketing effort, because of the way they played football. Now, I don't want to watch Arsenal play. They always have a defensive mistake or two. I think Arteta may be correcting some of this, but they would sit deeper. They would look disorganized. Spurs have gone from being very watchable. There was a great discussion on ESPN FC Wednesday night. Craig Burley really going on about how if clubs are not, with the ticket prices today in England, Chris, if clubs are not going to entertain you the way Spurs did under Pochettino, yes, they didn't win anything in the 5 years he was there, but they were second one year or third a couple other times and played great football, then what's the point? Would you sacrifice everything to watch dour football for 9 months under Jose Mourinho so you can win a Carabao Cup or get to a Carabao Cup final? That's the question. And I think Spurs are clearly not as good to watch as they were just 6 months ago, and on and on and on. And you've got teams at the top a team at the top that never drops points. That's somewhat interesting, but the matches are frustrating to watch if you're a neutral. So, I think the Premier League has got a problem, but it's cyclical. I'll just say that, Chris. So right. 3 years from now, we could be talking about how competitive and how great the league is. Yeah,
to me, at the end of the day, what I'm looking for is is excitement, is creativity, and that's what I'm not getting from the Premier League this season. Liverpool, absolutely, fantastic performances. I see the creativity there. I see just how fast and how direct they are when they break, and that's entertaining. But if I look at the Premier League table, I look at the top 8. And in there's some teams that, I mean, Spurs to me are not as good as they used to be. You got Man United in 7th. I mean, really poor. Wolves, who've kind of come off the tracks a little bit in the last few games, but still kind of in terms of their shape, very, very good in terms of the way that they play. Sheffield United, which has been a fantastic story this season and really interesting to watch. Chelsea, up and down. So you've only got really kind of a few clubs in there that have creativity. Leicester City would be one of them, I'd say. Man City on their day. Liverpool, of course. And then beyond that, 9 through 20, I mean, you got Everton in 9th place. And I love Everton, but, you know, I mean, it's kind of, I mean, they've had an awful season. Arsenal in 10th. I mean, you got these teams that are just really poor. And even down to the bottom of the table, in terms of the relegation zone, is that... I mean, the past in terms of liking the relegation battle would be because there would be some decent teams fighting for survival, trying to stay up. But lately, say in the last 5 years, it just seems to be a lot of weak teams, like a lot of really poor teams battling it out. And it's kind of, it's, you know, whoever's the worst gets relegated.
Actually, you kind of hit it on that, Chris. Sorry to interrupt, but there was someone I talked to who watches the Premier League very, very closely who made that same observation to me, that it's actually, when I was complaining about Liverpool 110 points and Man City 100 points, said, no, it's more about the teams from 14 to 20 have been consistently worse the last 3 or 4 seasons, in his opinion, in the Premier League than any time since the breakaway from the Football League in the early 90s. That's really the issue. Is those clubs are not able to compete in a high-spending league, and so they play dour football, they park the bus, and then once in a while you have a club like Blackpool that was back in 2010, but like Norwich that comes up this year and tries to play football, and they have no chance. Mm-hmm. So then any other club coming up will play the kind of bad football that, quite frankly, keeps them in the league, though. So, I think you may have just hit on it. Actually, that might be the more serious issue.
And that was the thing after that Man United Wolves game. I was like looking for another match to watch, thinking, okay, there's got to be something out there that's better. And I watched Valencia against Celta de Vigo, and this within the first 10 minutes was far more entertaining than United against Wolves. A lot more creativity. Fantastic fingertip save. I mean, a great shot. Not the most entertaining game by any means, but it was better than Man United against Wolves, and a great win there for Valencia. Now, Kartik, my game of the week was, and I watched this live going into it, thinking, okay, let me see what this is all about. Well, not all about, but this is one I thought that would be pretty entertaining, and it was Werder Bremen against Dortmund in the DFB Pokal, which is the German Cup. Watched this on ESPN 3. The commentator was Kevin Hatchard. And this one, I mean, it's who needs defenses when you have Dortmund and Werder Bremen? This was just an open-ended, back and forth, incredible game. I mean, in terms of even the production, the way that it was done, like a lot of close-ups of the fans in the stadium, a packed-out stadium, great atmosphere, beers in hand, and then just all out for Werder Bremen, hoping that they would win this one. And they started off very strong. I think leading 2-0, but then in the second half, Erling Haaland came on in the 67th minute. Actually, before that, I think at halftime he came on. So within about 20 minutes, he scored, and then I watched this live, so I had no expectations, but a simply incredible goal by Gio Reyna, Claudio Reyna's son, which probably most of us have seen now on social media if you didn't watch the game live, but scores a beauty of a goal around about the 79th minute to pull another goal back to be Dortmund 2, Werder Bremen 3, and then he almost won a penalty, and he got yellow carded. But just an exceptional game on this one. It's a really, really entertaining. And Werder Bremen win 3-2. That was my game of the week. I really enjoyed it. Fantastic stuff there.
I find it interesting that that match, which was a fantastic match, and by the way, Bremen is fighting relegation, yet they threw out their best team, or close to their best team for this match against Dortmund. Dortmund did not necessarily throw out their best team and had to chase the game late. But I find it interesting that both this match and the Bayern-Hoffenheim match, which was another really, really good game, were on ESPN3 and not on ESPN Plus, meaning if you have a cable subscription, they were accessible if you went online. Now, we know the Bundesliga is moving to ESPN next year. We've been told there are going to be only 4 matches on broadcast linear television, Chris, but would they have the option to do this with some Bundesliga matches? Because this does make things a whole lot more accessible and quell some of my anxiety about the league that now it turns out I'm watching the most. I'm watching it more than the Premier League the last couple months. Going to behind a paywall.
It's a separate TV deal, so I would imagine in terms of the way the contract was written and then whatever ESPN guaranteed to them, where they said, okay, all right, we're going to show all these games on ESPN3, and I think in Spanish language on ESPN Deportes. That's where we might be with that one. So I don't think that it would mean that automatically, like for next season, all those games would be on ESPN Plus. But in terms of the DFB talking to ESPN and talking about ways to improve the deal that they have in place and make an amendment or addendum to go ahead and actually make this happen, that's a possibility. Yeah, I mean in some ways too. I mean, depending on how you look at it, ESPN3 for some people would be more accessible than an ESPN Plus. I mean, ESPN Plus is behind that paywall, but it's $5 a month, and as we'll get to a little bit later, subscriber numbers are up. So for some people, ESPN Plus is probably more accessible if they already have it, and it's a lot easier to watch all your German games there as well as Serie A, etc. But that's a good point, Kartik. I guess we'll see next season. Now, in terms of some of the other things I watched from this past week, some of the highlights, I watched a ton of matches, but the coverage of the Madrid derby on beIN Sports in English was really a disappointment, because I went into this one thinking, okay, this is the biggest La Liga game of the weekend. This is massive. And beIN Sports, there's only 2 people in the studio, George Metellus and Kalen Kyle. There's no Gary Bailey. There's no Thomas Rongen. There's no Fernando Fiore. 1-0 to Real Madrid, score relatively early. And done and dusted. It just felt like it was just not that they're mailing it in, but it just felt like it was just another La Liga game, nothing special. Now, on the Spanish language side, I didn't watch that. I would imagine that they kind of went all out and had a lot more of kind of in-depth analysis and that. But ever since beIN Sports has lost Kevin Egan, Kay Murray, Terry Lee, Jeremy St. Louis. I mean, these are people that would add a lot more of excitement and, have more people on the set, in the studio, discussing, having debates back and forth. But it's hard to do that when you have George Metellus as presenter, Kalen Kyle kind of sharing her analysis, and that's it. There's no debate or discussion. It's kind of just, what do you think, Kalen? I think this. Okay, George, thanks. It's just really, really weak stuff from beIN Sports there.
What I would say about this is that I think you've got a situation where beIN, and I think I don't want to get into it on air, but I think you and I both know the situation with the contract situation with some of their talent, where they're just, unless it's a Super Clasico, it's an El Clasico, excuse me, I'm thinking Mexico. Unless it's an El Clasico, they don't seem to be willing to activate the full arsenal of commentary talent that they have. And unfortunately for them, one of the El Clasicos ended up being midweek this year, right?
On a Wednesday, 2 o'clock in the afternoon, right?
Yeah. But I was disappointed by this because I tuned into this match and the broadcast thinking it was going to be some sort of at least semi-comprehensive analysis and coverage. And this is, again, when I say I haven't switched off the Premier League completely because of NBC, this is why. There is still something I can sit and watch. This past weekend, I wrote about it. We'll get to that column in a minute or a little later in the show. But I watched Ahmed Fareed, Robbie Mustoe, and Kyle Martino, and I watched the pre-match show or the Goal Zone show, and I get something from it. So that's the bottom line.
Which may be one explanation or one reason why that. I gravitate still to the Premier League. Usually impulsively first because I know the coverage is going to be better. I can tune into the Bundesliga where I'm not sure what's going to show up. I can tune into beIN Sports where right now there's not a lot of people even kind of working in the studio. I can tune into ESPN and there'll be no crew giving me pre-match analysis for some of these. Copa del Rey games or FA Cup, whatever it is. NBC Sports really at this point, other than TNT for Champions League, would be the only one that you can go into thinking, okay, I'm going to get a full dose of analysis, discussion, basically an immersive experience. Now, the games themselves may not be that good. Not as good as we want them to be, but yeah, that's a big reason. That's a big reason to pull people in.
Fox, we've talked about it over and over again. Bundesliga, it's very random. Again, this weekend they had a studio show for Bayern and Mainz, or Mainz and Bayern, with Lawless, Ian Joy, Alexi Lawless, Ian Joy, Kate Abdo. I thought the show was pretty good, but then the better games on the weekend they didn't have any wraparound coverage for. So again, they could do it on every once in a while. But you don't get the consistency. You turn on any Premier League match or any Premier League pre-match on NBC, even in cases like this weekend when Rebecca Lowe isn't there. Even when you don't have your lead presenter there is a certain standard and quality and level of analysis and level of presentation you're not getting from anyone else who covers the sport in this country. And that includes ESPN, who knock it out of the park if they have a studio with Dan Thomas and Alejandro Moreno and Craig Burley and Steve Nicol and whoever else, Stu Robson, etc., for a match. But then all too often when they have things on ESPN Plus, there's no wraparound, there's no bumper, there's nothing. So again, NBC, this is part of the reason why the Premier League remains so compelling, in spite of all the critiques you and I are making of the league itself, or the quality of play and the matches themselves.
Yeah, the only other league I can look at in the United States and look at and guarantee that there's going to be quality coverage, pre-match, halftime, post-match, is Liga MX in the United States. And Saturday night, I watched Monterrey against Querétaro. Keith Costigan and Kobe Jones commentating this one. This was on FS2. And the interesting thing, Kartik, about this, okay, so in the past, I've been told by Fox Sports PR that if a game's on FS2, then oftentimes there's no studio they're not working it. Basically, there's no studio show. It's usually kind of just the commentators. Well, this one on FS2 with the Liga MX, at halftime, you had highlights from all the other games in Liga MX. You had the goal highlights, etc. You had discussions, a little bit of analysis there from both Keith Costigan and Kobe Jones, both of them doing a good job. But that's something we don't get with Bundesliga games on FS2, where the halftime show and post-match, it's basically it's just promo reels from the Bundesliga. It's not even from Fox. So to me, then that shows that, obviously Fox knows that they've lost the rights to the Bundesliga after the season. So they're probably thinking, why even put any effort in? Let's just scale back. And at least with Liga MX, for some of these English language games for 3 clubs, they have the rights. So maybe there's an incentive for them to do a little bit more and give better coverage, because they will continue to show those teams. Kartik, did you catch any of the U.S. women's national team games or U.S. men's national team games?
Yeah, I watched some of the CONCACAF games. Pretty straightforward. I thought Haiti was unfortunate in the game against the U.S. They played very well in that match. Obviously, these matches are on various Fox networks. Some are on Fox FS1, some are on FS2, some are on FS Plus. Then there was the U.S.-Costa Rica men's game. There was a U.S.-Costa Rica women's game also, but men's game on ESPN News, bumped to ESPN News. It's a non-FIFA date friendly with B teams. And I was very encouraged to see Brian Dunseth, who I think is really good and really underutilized. Obviously, he does Real Salt Lake games and some other things that on a localized level that limit his availability for national broadcast, but still love to see him more on national coverage. And since Fox lost the Champions League, haven't seen him on any European coverage. He used to do fairly regularly some Champions League matches. He was outstanding. I thought Adrian Healy, who was the who we haven't heard much of lately, right? Doing U.S. or MLS games because of John Champion's relocation to the U.S. and Ian Dark still continuing to do the higher profile U.S. men's and women's games on ESPN. I thought that Healy maybe was trying a little too hard to sell how good this generation of American players were, which is a constant problem among American commentators, overselling, overhyping players. I thought there was a little of that from Healy. Dunseth reined it back in a little bit, so that's how I would analyze the coverage of that match.
Yeah, and the game itself was relatively decent. I mean, my big complaint about this would be that you really can't judge the level of the US team when they're playing much weaker opposition. It would have been great to have kind of a tougher game to get to really see what this US team is made out of. But there were some promising signs, some promising youngsters playing in this game. I think Ulysses, who'd scored the penalty kick, was a standout. But overall, I agree with you about Brian Dunseth. I'd love to see more of him. I mean, he's a great co-commentator.
Yeah, Ulysses Linus, it's good to see him now playing for the U.S. His father actually is very active on Twitter. I interact with him on Twitter. Had been previously very critical of the U.S. Soccer Federation, and I share many of those critiques. And his son got a move to he came up in the LA Galaxy Academy, got a move to Wolfsburg to their program last year, and finally got called into the senior national team, committed to the U.S. He was eligible to play for Mexico as well, and looked the part. And again, it's great that there's so many American players, particularly in Germany, at a young age. I think it's at least making them competitive at a senior level at the age of 18 or 19, whereas guys who've typically come through MLS, there have been exceptions. Josie Altidore was an exception, right? He was in the national team by the time he was 18, and he was playing in MLS before he moved to Spain. But generally, you're able to throw guys like Linus and Sargent out in senior matches, and they look the part, even if their growth curve is stunted at some point because they've gone to Germany and gotten competitive matches. Obviously, same thing with Pulisic, and I think Gio Reyna will be called in to the next set of U.S. games based on how he started his Dortmund career.
Absolutely. I watched Milan against Verona, Hellas Verona in Serie A. This one with commentators. This was kind of a walk down memory lane. It was commentators Steve Banyard, who used to do a ton of Premier League matches for the World Feed that we used to listen to through Fox Soccer Channel, and co-commentator Trevor Francis. It's been ages since I've heard Trevor Francis do a commentary. So long, in fact, that I heard the voice. I'm like, okay, whose voice is that? That sounds really, really familiar. And I had to do a little bit of research, and then came back, and then the light bulb went off in my head. I was like, yeah, it's Trevor Francis. Who used to play in Serie A for Sampdoria and Atalanta. But a great game. This was a good game. Much better than some of the other Serie A matches I've watched of late. And Daniel Maldini making his debut for Milan at the age of 18, the club where his father and grandfather played at. So, yeah, great game. And Verona actually looked really good too.
Yeah, and where his grandfather was a legendary manager as well. Trevor Francis, little piece of trivia, first £1 million player in English football history when Manchester City bought him from Brian Clough's Nottingham Forest, where he had won a European Cup when Manchester City overspent on him after the 80-81 season and ended up kind of flaming out at City, going to Sampdoria, having a really good career in Italy for a few seasons before coming back. He came back to QPR, right? I want to say after he left Italy. But yeah, Trevor Francis is actually a very he went where?
Well, Glasgow Rangers, I think for a little bit, but then went to QPR.
Right, before. and then went to QPR. But yeah, and actually a pretty significant player in English football history, first £1 million player. And ironically enough, Manchester City, who was not one of the wealthiest clubs at the time, but was a pretty successful club. That was the period of time when I became a Manchester City fan. Pretty successful at that time before several relegations after that. But Manchester City actually is the club that first broke the bank for a £1 million player, even though this is long before the days of Sheikh Mansour. So a little bit of trivia there.
Actually, it was Forrest that broke the record of the £1 million for when he bought him from Birmingham, not City.
Maybe. I've always thought it was City. I think City, it was like 1.2 million. Maybe, yeah. Maybe
it was Forrest because of Brian Clough, I think, and they had signed him on that one. But one more piece of
trivia. They sold him at a profit to City. That's
right, exactly. One more piece of trivia about Trevor Francis, other than that he was actually a really good co-commentary, some good tactical analysis, some really good observations in this game I watched, was that he also played in the NASL for the Detroit Express back in the late 70s. So
a lot of goal game in the NASL, by the way.
There you go.
I think his stat line is like 35 matches, 32 goals, something like that, almost a goal a game.
Nice. One last thing from me, Kartik, in terms of what I watched this past week, before we move on to the news and streaming section, is that the FA Cup replays. I mean, there were two that were televised this week, both of which were streamed on ESPN Plus. Both of them were highly entertaining. Both of them were great games to watch. The Liverpool-Shrewsbury game was not shown on UK television, and as a result, it wasn't shown worldwide. But the Oxford-Newcastle game was a great one. A late comeback there by Oxford, almost knocking Newcastle out of the tournament. And then Spurs against Southampton, and Southampton put in a fantastic performance, scored a magical goal from Danny Ings. But this was entertaining. And in some ways, I think, Kartik, in terms of, I mean, these teams going into a replay know that it's win or go home. I mean, it's one of those things that you have to win the match in order to progress to the next round, where in a traditional FA Cup tie, you know that a draw is enough to get a replay. And it made a big, huge difference. Yeah.
Real quickly on this, I watched parts of the Newcastle-Oxford match, Oxford-Newcastle match, and Stuart Robson, I know I bring this up consistently, Chris, but because he watches other leagues and he broadcasts other leagues other than the Premier League, he has a knowledge of players. And he said, I've watched Almiron in MLS. He said it a few times, right? Mm-hmm. When he was talking about Miguel Almiron specifically. But he brings something to broadcasts of English football that a lot of other co-commentators do because they're not watching other leagues. And I have to once again register my displeasure that the Premier League Productions, for whatever reason, doesn't use them on Premier League matches. And that's, I know it's something I say every fifth podcast. I think we do, but that was again another example. The way he broadcast that match, some of the analysis he gave, that reminded me, this is a pretty big loss for the Premier League.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, Stuart Robson would probably be the number one best global co-commentator in terms of having a knowledge. You can put him into pretty much any major league around the world, and he'd be able to talk eloquently about the players, the history, the clubs, etc. Where, say, I don't know, a Gary Neville, if you took Gary Neville and put him into an ESPN broadcast of an MLS game, he'd be lost. He'd be like, okay, I have no idea who these players are. Stuart Robson is somebody who has a really... I can't think of anyone else. Can you, Kartik, that would have that type of knowledge?
I really can't. In terms of a co-commentator in the English language. The one thing I will also say, though, excuse me, is sometimes it rears its head in another way, which was, we talked about this when we had John Nicholson on, when Robson had a diatribe about the Premier League being very arrogant. And then citing, hey, I cover Serie A, I cover the Bundesliga, I cover MLS, and they don't have any of these problems. Sometimes I think maybe the feeling is among Premier League fans, and Premier League fans are I've talked about it before on this show, a bunch who seem to be American Premier League fans, very league-centric and protective of the league and very much into promoting the league, that Robson has got this kind of very negative vibe towards the Premier League, which may limit his exposure in some respects. And then, of course, also his traditional critiques of Arsenal, although that probably is now no longer an issue with Wenger not at the club anymore.
Yeah, I think though that Stuart Robson, for whatever reason, we don't know what the reason is, but I think it's really due to the Arsenal criticism more than anything, where he was, looked at as somebody that was overly critical. In hindsight, I was completely in agreement with him back then. I'm in complete agreement with him now in terms of where we see Arsenal, the club, and kind of how it's fallen off the top perch in terms of quality and depth and the way the club has been run. And Wenger's partly to blame for that in terms of the way the club was kind of really getting off the path of being one of the top clubs in England. Yes, it could get back to that, but it's unlikely in the near future that would happen. So I think that's really the reason that which you would think at this point in time, bring Robson back in. Even the Wenger's gone in terms of management in the Premier League. But it could be Stuart Robson too. Stuart Robson might say, you know what, I'm not really interested in doing the Premier League. I'd rather focus on my specialization, which is everything from Major League Soccer to Serie A to Champions League to leagues from around the world, and that's maybe what he enjoys more, perhaps. One of these days, Kartik, I know you've interviewed him many years ago, but we'll have to have him back on and talk more in depth about his knowledge and about his story. All right, Kartik, let's move on to TV streaming news.
Yeah, so very, very big news. First reported by Dan Laletta. We reported it, confirmed it afterwards, which is that the NWSL TV rights are moving to CBS. And Grant Wall also reported it. And according to Grant Wall, he had a little more layer in terms of what he's reporting, which is that more than a dozen NWSL games are expected to be shown on a CBS linear platform this year, including on CBS's main over-the-air channel, with out-of-market NWSL games expected to be available on CBS All Access. Now, what's interesting about this, Chris, is I hadn't thought about the fact that the summer fits a real hole in CBS's programming. They do have a lot of PGA Tour events over the summer. They have more events over the summer than NBC does. NBC and CBS, if you're not familiar with the golf contract, NBC and CBS basically trade off tournaments. And that's why a lot of times we've seen the number of times when the Premier League match that would be on NBC over the air is put on NBCSN. That's because NBC's got golf that week. But then the weeks that during the PGA Tour season, when there's no interruption to the Premier League being on NBC over the air, generally that's because CBS has the tournament that week. But there are holes in their programming calendar over the summer. There's no NFL. There's no college basketball, those being their two big things other than golf. College football, they may be out of the college football business or kind of out of it, not totally out of it, but kind of more out of it than they are now in the very near future based on what's happening with renewals there. So this actually does fit a hole in their programming schedule. Now, the question is, would Major League Soccer fit the same hole? But the MLS contract isn't up now. CBS jumps. They're trying to push All Access. Selling All Access the way Disney Plus and NBC Sports Gold, all these things have popped up, or Peacock. So it's more like Peacock and Disney Plus than like ESPN Plus or NBC Sports Gold. So they're trying to sell CBS All Access. Perfect timing. Mm-hmm. Octagon, the NWSL media partner, seems to have struck gold. I was kind of skeptical, thinking, why would NWSL retain a big name media agency when perhaps their rights aren't that lucrative? Well, they seem to have. Again, it's not official yet, but Chris, they seem to have struck gold with this one. This is very, very big for the game in this country, potentially. Yeah, it's good news for NWSL in terms of that reach and financial commitments there. That we're not sure how much CBS is going to be paying for these rights, but that's a good positive sign for the future of the league.
The issue with this one, though, too, it's not really an issue, but it's again another example of how almost everything is moving towards streaming. So, whether it's the Bundesliga, whether it's Serie A, now you have NWSL, and again, in each of these examples, there's select games, some more than others, that will be on television, a game of the week. But for the most part, we're moving again more and more towards streaming. So that appears to be the future, other than for the biggest leagues, the Liga MX, the La Liga, Major League Soccer, and the Premier League, where they're still very linear television based. And that could change over time too, where perhaps with the next TV deal for Major League Soccer coming up in about a year and a half, there's a possibility that more and more of those games could go to a streaming platform. But yeah, this is good news for NWSL. Moving on, a couple of news items here, Kartik. I'll go first with mine, and that is that FS1 and NBCSN are now in fewer than 80 million homes. Sports Business Daily reported this last week, with the FS1 number at 79 million, the lowest in network history. NBCSN at 79 million also, which is their fewest number of homes they've been in since 2014. Again, this is another example of cord cutting. People cancelling their cable subscriptions and moving to a streaming platform. And with the case with NBC, with Peacock launching this spring, that's their way of continuing to keep those cord cutters, keeping those subscribers. Fox, as of right now, really don't have a really strong streaming package. So if you cut the cord, there aren't as many options for Fox at this present time. But and then Kartik, in continuation of kind of this move to streaming, another news item for you.
So ESPN Plus is climbed to over 6 million paid subscribers following the Disney Plus launch and the Disney Plus bundle. As I mentioned, I think last week or 2 weeks ago, I had actually would count twice then because I'd subscribed via the bundle and had already had a subscription. But nonetheless, that bundle, I think, has really helped grow ESPN Plus's footprint in advance of the Bundesliga moving there and all these other properties. Additionally, let's keep in mind that they had rolled ESPN Insider subscribers into Plus, and now to where Plus also has written content, the old Insider content, if you go to the ESPN.com site. So it's not necessarily all straight subscriptions to ESPN Plus for their video content, but still 7.6 million is a really impressive number. Absolutely.
Yeah. And how many of those are actually watching soccer is probably like a small number, but still that's a good base to build on. 7.6 million and growing very, very quickly. Moving on, Kartik, Euro 2020 is this summer. We're looking forward to it. I mean, me personally, in terms of the competitive level, France, I would imagine, would be the favorites. But if somebody's able to actually knock France off, there's a lot of other teams that could be quite interesting in terms of potentially winning this tournament this summer. This one, of course, being played throughout the European continent, and I'm really excited about it. But in terms of television coverage, of course, we know that ESPN has the rights to this competition. As of recording, no announcements have been made in terms of talent. What I am hearing is that ESPN will be hiring some big names for this competition to be doing the studio analysis. Now, in subsequent conversations I've had with other sources, some names that have been thrown out, and there's no guarantee that any of these would be hired for ESPN, but some names that have been mentioned in discussions include Sir Alex Ferguson, Gary Lineker, and Gary Neville. And you could imagine any of those three, or all three of those, would make a huge impact in terms of any network having them providing studio analysis about the Euro 2020 tournament. What about you, Kartik? If you had a choice between those three, which one would you take?
Gary Lineker for sure. Although I think Sir Alex Ferguson would probably be pretty interesting. And Gary Neville is very analytical. A little bit of a bonus item then on this, and this is for UK audiences, US audiences, this may not make a difference. The rumor now, pretty hot rumor, that Jermaine Genius is being groomed to eventually replace Gary Lineker. as BBC's lead, match of the day presenter. So that's an interesting one. Genius has been impressive when I've seen him. The limited times I've been able to see him catch British television via VPN or clips, but that's who is in line, according to many of the rumors out there, to replace Lineker long term at the BBC.
And Kartik, one more news item.
Yeah, so the CAS ruling on promotion and relegation, the case filed by Miami FC, who, in the interest of full disclosure, I formerly was a full-time employee of. I still continue to do some work with them. And Kingston Stockade FC has been revealed by the New York Times. Basically, the CAS filing, the CAS claim was denied. It was a effort to bring promotion and relegation to the United States, to the soccer system, the league system of the United States, following Article 9 of the FIFA statutes. The CAS ruled in favor of FIFA, CONCACAF, and U.S. Soccer on this. I am not sure at the moment we tape this whether we will ever see the full ruling, which is my understanding is somewhere near 50 pages. If we will ever see that full ruling see the light of day so that people can go through it, because what we found with the CAS claim for Crossfire FC, DeAndre Yedlin's former youth club, was a leak, right, to a reporter. I think it was Jeff Carlisle or Grant Wall. I think it was to Grant Wall. Basically, Crossfire has lost the case, right? Mm-hmm. Chris, you remember this.
Yeah.
Then a few months later, Carlisle got his hands on the ruling and said, well, actually, there's all of this in the ruling that's favorable towards Crossfire, favorable towards the possibility or the potential in the future for U.S. youth clubs to try and force training compensation and solidarity payments. So until we see the full ruling and the wording, I don't think we can make any definitive judgments. Yes, it is a setback at this point to the idea of blowing open the league system, MLS, USL, NISA, the sanctioned professional leagues in the United States, and forcing promotion and relegation. However, until we see the full ruling, and I would urge people who are distraught this week about this ruling, we don't really know the devil's always in the details. But again, I am not sure those 50 pages will ever be leaked. We'll see.
Yeah, so according to Tariq, who writes for the New York Times, he did mention the tribunal concluded that while the wording of Article 9 of the FIFA guidelines could be understood as rendering that provision to be universally applicable, FIFA didn't intend for the rule to apply to US soccer. And Kartik, that's huge because, and I'll get into the TV ramifications in a minute, but this is huge because FIFA didn't intend for the rule to apply to US soccer. Says who? Says FIFA? I mean, maybe they had discussions with FIFA recently.
Yeah, they had. I could say this, that they, maybe I don't want to be speaking out of school because, again, I previously worked for one of the litigants and one of the plaintiffs, and I also still continue to do some work with them. So I will say that the FIFA had a defense that essentially there had been conversations between Sepp Blatter and Chuck Blazer, who we know all about, that effectively exempted the U.S. from this provision of FIFA statutes.
Yeah.
So that's actually, maybe that'll come out in time. Maybe I've given more information than I should have just now. But that is exactly what they're referring to.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I mentioned before too, a guideline is not a guideline; it's a statute. And that's the thing, though, too. There's that. FIFA didn't intend for the rule to apply to U.S. soccer. Is that included in the statute? No, it's not. And that's the thing, though, too, Kartik. So Australia, FIFA made sure that that Australia went ahead and with promotion relegation and pushed very heavily on them in terms of making sure that would happen. But the rules are different for U.S. soccer, and I think it's one of those things that. This is a perfect example of, really, to me, how MLS Commissioner Don Garber is a fantastic politician. In terms of, and I'm sure meeting with, well, we know he met with the FIFA head Gianni, and that's the thing though too. There's that he's played his cards right in terms of making sure that this CAS ruling was in their favor. As a result of this, though, too, I mean, the likelihood of promotion relegation happening within the United States at the top level is almost zero to me, in my belief. Yeah. And this does put MLS in a fantastic position to protect their assets, to protect their the business model in many ways. I mean, it is the business model. And from a TV perspective, to me, it makes it less competitive. It makes it less interesting when you don't have any clubs coming into the system based on merit, based on performances. You only have them moving up into the top league based on the owners putting in, $100, $200, $250 million dollars of money. That has no relevance to the quality of that team. So it's interesting, disappointed with the ruling. I think it's kind of strange that it says that the CAS says that the FIFA didn't intend for the rule to apply to US soccer. I'd like to find out more information about that. So, is this the FIFA of now that mentioned that, or is this that they have some documents to prove that this was?
Well, Gianni Infantino, I would mention also. I think his hitched FIFA even more so than Sepp Blatter did to American money and American corporate sponsors and an alliance with the U.S.
Right. And it's 2026 World Cup. I mean, that's the biggest cash cow ever.
That's one piece of it. I think in general, you've seen in the wake of the FIFA scandals a lot of hand-wringing about FIFA in Western Europe. So you've seen, with the exception of Adidas, who is basically a life FIFA connection, Western European companies dropped or distanced themselves as sponsors or corporate partners of FIFA. And what you've seen is a lot of American companies, Chinese companies from the Middle East come in. Mm-hmm. And Gazprom from Russia, right? So I think Infantino is very strategically positioning FIFA in alliance with non-Western European nations. It's ironic considering he's Italian and he's the former president of UEFA, but against essentially the Italys, the Englands, the Netherlands, the Germans, against those countries. And quite frankly, with some of the rogue football nations, because the United States would be at the top of the list of any rogue football nation, if you're being perfectly honest about it, right? I'm not talking about rogue nations in terms of a foreign policy, like maybe you would perceive North Korea or Iran. I'm talking about in terms of the way they structure football. Mm-hmm. And Australia and the United States would be at the top of the list of what I would consider rogue nations in terms of the way they structure the sport in their countries. And Infantino doesn't seem to have the same level of concern about the way the U.S., the way Australia. I mean, maybe there's something there too. He's been less aggressive about pursuing promotion and relegation in Australia than Blatter had been. So I think there's something there. There's more going on in terms of sponsorship money, in my opinion, than maybe is on the surface.
Yeah, and to me, it's all about the money. It's all about the power. And that's what's really driving this, making sure that the ruling goes in the favor of U.S. soccer and most importantly, in this case, Major League Soccer, where there is now practically no competition in the United States, even within the league itself. And you look at, we've been criticizing the Premier League for the poor quality that this season in particular. But without promotion relegation, you wouldn't have the Sheffield Uniteds, you wouldn't have the Wolverhampton Wanderers, you wouldn't have some of these teams that have come up from the second tier into the top league to make it more competitive and more interesting. And that has an impact on television viewing numbers. We know that the TV numbers for Major League Soccer are disappointing. There are really very few people watching Major League Soccer, to be frank. So when you look at those numbers and you look at the other leagues from around the world and look at those numbers in the United States for those viewing numbers, there's a reason that those numbers are much larger than Major League Soccer, and that's because it's more competitive for the most part. It's at the higher quality, and that's why people are watching those games instead of Major League Soccer. And this ruling today has a negative impact to me in terms of decreasing the value of watching Major League Soccer. To me, with promotion relegation, that would make the Major League Soccer far more interesting, far more riveting and engaging, and give me a reason to watch that league. Without it, yes, I will watch it, but it's not as of interest and not as of high quality as it would be with other countries. All right, Kartik. TV ratings, we mentioned before, Man United against Wolves on NBC and Universo. Over 1 million viewers for this game, a huge number for what was really an awful game. Spurs against Man City on NBCSN, 732,000 viewers for this one. Pretty decent for a Sunday morning game, and actually it was a good game. I enjoyed this one. Barcelona against Levante on beIN Sports on Sunday, 95,000 viewers for that one. Then you had the US women's national team games. They had the 3 games last week. The highest was 322,000 viewers for the game against Costa Rica on FS1 on Monday night. Moving on to listener mailbag. First up is Gerardo Ramos. He says, gotta say, top job by Ahmed Farid on NBCSN coverage last weekend. Big shoes to fill. Rebecca Lowe's spot, and he has done an excellent job. And Kartik, you mentioned this too in your brand new column that you have, which is called On the TV Media. And it's at worldsoccertalk.com every Monday morning. The first column was last week, and some good insights, some good analysis. So listeners, if you do get a chance, check that out for the next every week on Mondays.
Yeah, and just in short on Ahmed Farid, Chris, I mean, what I talked about in the column was that I'm not always in love with multi-sports presenters presenting soccer, but he has gotten gradually better. He started with midweek games last season, and now I'm very comfortable with him. I think he has a lot of knowledge of the league, and I don't see a huge drop-off between him and when Rebecca Lowe's not there or Derek Ray's not called in. So I think he's done a fantastic job, and that's more credit to NBC, right? They get so much right in how they produce and present the sport.
The one thing about Rebecca that she does very well, I mean, many things very well, but this in particular, is that she makes it sound more natural. She makes it sound that she's not reading from a teleprompter. Ahmed's good, really, really good. But sometimes it's not that it sounds like he's coming from a teleprompter, but it sounds more kind of just stated. Rebecca just feels kind of natural, as if she's talking off the cuff, which I'm sure sometimes she is. But that's the feeling I get watching the broadcasts. Next up is Amber. Amber says, love the podcast, and I maintain if UEFA mandated the 4th Champions League spot to go to the FA Cup champion, then more clubs would take the FA Cup seriously. Time to scrap replays, and especially now with loads of fixtures, especially after the festive period. Gorilla Talk says, I'm sitting at a coffee shop listening to World Soccer Talk podcast. Yes, Americans care more about leagues than clubs for the most part. We've had competing leagues in every sport at one point, NFL versus AFL, National League, Senior Circuit versus American League, Junior Circuit. There used to be other major baseball leagues as well, NBA versus ABA, NHL versus WHL. Colleges are promoting league loyalty because of their broadcast rights or their own TV station. Next up is JP. JP says, interesting discussion on being a fan of a club versus a fan of the league. Are you guys saying that soccer fans in Europe only follow their club but don't watch other clubs in the same league? And let me just interject there, JP. Absolutely. For the most part, you mean if you're a supporter of Manchester United or something like that, and you're living in England, and you're, kind of a true-blooded fan, the likelihood of you turning in and watching a Liverpool match or watching a Man City match is extremely unlikely. You're going to be watching that club, probably focusing most of your time and efforts on that club solely. Also, on top of that, though, too, is that you have a lot less TV coverage, so there's fewer opportunities to watch other games from that league. That plays into it a little bit too, but absolutely. I mean, most supporters would be focusing on their club specifically, and could care less about the league itself or the league institution or anything to do with the league. If anything, the league is looked at as a negative. The club itself is the be-all and end-all. So let me continue from JP's comment. That would seem weird to me, as the performance and results of the other clubs impact where your club falls or rises in the standings. Also want to compare how your club looks relative to its closest rivals and what improvements may be needed. That is mostly how American fans follow American sports such as NFL, NBA, etc. Have your favorite or local team that you follow closely, but also watch games of other teams if you have the opportunity via national television. For soccer, it's a special case, as the majority of American fans of European club soccer are neutrals for the most part. We may gravitate to one particular league for a myriad of reasons, such as nationality or ease of access. Might have a favorite club within that league, but for the most part, watching whatever is presented and not living and dying with the performance of that one club. Kartik, before I go in any further, any thoughts so far on what JP's been saying?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's more just league pride, though, in American fans. You know, I've noticed that just in terms of college sports conferences, the ALNL thing that Gorilla Talk mentioned is definitely something. I mean, I used to engage in that 20 years ago when I watched baseball. I was an NL fan. I thought the AL had bastardized rules and was very much the junior circuit. That's the way I viewed it. I think that's just something, maybe because of the way sport has evolved in this country, that it's been about leagues and there's such league promotions, and these teams are in many cases franchises. Now, what you've seen in college sports is schools in the last 20 years begin to jump from conference to conference. And create super leagues, essentially like the Big Five. We have a Power Five conferences, like we have Big Five European leagues in European football. But that maybe dissipate a little bit because the traditional rivalries and conference affiliations have broken down a little bit. But still, I think Americans in general are more sort of league centric, and there are fans of universities, fans of University of Florida fans, Michigan fans. Michigan fans will probably turn on just about any Big Ten game. Florida fans will probably turn on just about any SEC game. They won't watch ACC, Big Ten, Big 12 matches, and so forth. So I think the league thing is present here.
Yeah, and to me, it's far bigger in this country than overseas in terms of that focus on the league. JP finishes up. He says, to expand on the college sports versus European soccer angle, many fans in America will take pride in the number of teams their conference gets in the NCAA basketball tournament and how far they advance. See something similar with the Champions League here in America with the Premier League or La Liga or Bundesliga in 2013 will boast about how their teams advance in the tournament, even if not fans of those particular clubs, as proof that their league is better. Real Madrid and Atleti 2014 and 2016, Liverpool and Tottenham 2019. Do the fans in Europe also do this, or is it just an American fan dynamic for those who follow European football?
I think fans in Europe do it. I think JP is onto something here. And yes, in the NCAA basketball tournament, that is definitely the culture. I would, when I was more into college basketball, and college basketball is the other sport that I've in my life been equally obsessive about with as soccer. So I used to do some of the same obsessive things. I used to track that at the beginning of the tournament and say, okay, the SEC got 4 bids. I think it's a garbage conference. Kentucky's the only team that should get in. Let's see how the other 3 teams that got bids did. And posted, in those days we didn't have Twitter, but posted on message boards. And then same thing with the ACC. I think the ACC is a great conference. They only got 6 bids. They should have gotten 8 and do the same thing. So yeah, it's the same culture. And certainly in 2013, you specifically mentioned that when Bayern played Dortmund in the final, I think it was vindication for a lot of people who had said the Bundesliga is more competitive, had beat that drum. There had been pushback against it. Oh, well, those teams never win anything in Europe. The Premier League has always got teams in the semifinals. La Liga's always got teams in the semifinals. Italy in those days had more teams making deep runs. So there would always be pushback. And remember, at one point, the Bundesliga had even lost their fourth spot.
Yep.
So there was a lot of chest pounding when that happened, when those two met in the final. And of course, the Bundesliga regained its fourth spot and has not lost it since and won't lose it. But I think that's there too. I would agree.
I would say, though, too, Kartik, just one more thing before we move on to the next comment, is that this comes more from the you mentioned about Europeans kind of focusing on this more in terms of if the Bundesliga does better one season than another, or like last season with Liverpool and Spurs in the final, and talking about the Premier League. To me, really, though, it's more of a media thing. It's more of the thing like, say, Talk Sport talking about it, saying like, look, isn't this wonderful? We got all these Premier League teams in the final, and also in the papers, whether it's the Independent or the Daily Mail, talking about how well the Premier League is doing. I'm not convinced that it's on the actual supporters themselves, where for them it's not as important to them. But within the media, it makes a great story and helps sell the league, which sells the newspapers, which sells the clicks. I think that's the focus more so. So sometimes it's probably not a good indication of how the feeling is within the country. I think it's just the feeling within the media itself. Moving on, next news item. News item. It's a comment from one of our listeners, and this one came from iTunes. And we'll read the good ones and we'll read the bad ones. This one is from NorCal Sticky Icky. Of the 5 or 6 episodes I've listened to, all of them, they seem to seemingly start out with how the host was only able to catch 15 minutes of football this weekend because of travel soccer. And of course, Kartik is such a hipster that he only watches games in the Albanian 12th division. So my 2 cents is that if you haven't watched any games, what the hell are you doing a podcast for? Or at the very least, maybe not start out every show by talking about all the soccer that you didn't watch. And while I appreciate the feedback there, NorCal Sticky Icky, what I would say is that we're not contrived. This is our honest opinions, and this is our honest discussions about what we did watch and what we didn't watch. We're both football supporters, football fans, journalists, in the media, podcasters, etc. But at the end of the day, we both have lives. I mean, Kartik, is married. I've got 4 kids, wonderful kids. I'm married too. I got a wife. From this past week, some weeks are better than others in terms of being able to watch soccer. This past week, I watched 16 games on television or streaming, and I think I went to like 2 or 3 high school football games, soccer games. So it's been a really busy week. Every single day is soccer for me, as it is for you, Kartik. But some weekends we get to watch more of it than we do, and other weekends we want a little bit of a break. We don't want to, we want to do other things in life.
Yeah, well, and then also I have to admit that when you talk about travel, generally it's football-related travel, soccer-related travel. So I'm seeing a lot of live games at the grassroots level. It's not that I'm a hipster that I'm watching the 12th division, the 5th division here in the U.S., 4th division. It's that I genuinely have worked with those clubs in those leagues. So again, this goes back to the point that there is more going on in the U.S. than just MLS, which sometimes MLS fans forget. But there have been weeks that I haven't watched enough football, truthfully, to comment on things. But that is because of other football, unfortunately.
Right.
Fortunately or unfortunately.
So Robert says, the comment about the show being anti-MLS was wrong. Your constructive criticism is accurate and useful. World is in the name, so it's not about only the US. I do worry about the rift Kartik pointed out between the MLS academies and other programs. Have either of you read Michael Calvin's great series on the Premier League? The UK, like other countries, see all young players as their prospects and vacuum them up. So the MLS is not any different. And Robert, I didn't read that book series. I'm not sure if you have, Kartik.
I am aware of it. I have not read it yet. I know that there's a lot of critiques of the Premier League in there that kind of mirror the John Nicholson critiques that we talked about when we had him on. So I'm looking forward to reading it. I have not yet. There's a lot more written kind of intellectual critique of the Premier League now out there than there was 3-4 years ago. It seemed like when I would criticize the Premier League for some of its practices with youth players, some of its practices on television and business, that I'd be giving those critiques in a vacuum. Now there's a lot of written material that backs it up. So I'm looking forward to reading that.
Monty Reed says, with ESPN Plus, I've watched more college soccer this past season than I have ever. I do not like high school college soccer rules. I'm okay with the unlimited subbing, but all the other rule changes are not good. Also, most of the high school refs also ref rec and club, and I have seen mistakes made due to referees confusing the different rules. I agree that the college season should be longer, and I think all college programs are training during the spring semester, so why not continue the season? What impact is Major League Soccer's academies raising up homegrown players having on the college game? Are we seeing more players going straight to Major League Soccer teams and skipping college? And I believe we are, Kartik, seeing that as a trend.
Yeah.
And I think it's a positive thing. I mean, for those professional athletes who want to make that their career and want to be the best of the best, I mean, I think that's the pathway to go.
In theory, it's a positive trend, and I know everybody has pushed this. I haven't seen any tangible results for the U.S. National teams that indicate that it's even at the youth level. I think when we had 18 of the 23 guys on our U20 rosters in college, and the other 5 were in Bundesliga academies or whatever, the results are the same as having the entire team as it has been the last 2 cycles in MLS academies. So I haven't seen any tangible results yet. That having been said, in theory, I completely agree. It would be great to get them all out of college and get them into academies at 18 and playing for first teams by the time they're 19 or 20.
Right. I mean, to me, the perfect example is Christian Pulisic, in terms of somebody that's, focused on becoming a fantastic professional at the top of his game, and going straight into club football and not going down the path of college. Next up is Azer, and he says, you guys have criticized Fox Sports for not putting any effort into showing a pre-game, halftime, post-game show for the Bundesliga when games are shown on FS2. What effort will ESPN show next season? The answer is 0. As long as I'm able to watch a game, I don't care about Fox's analysis. I'm sure many other people feel the same way. TNT has a studio crew for its Champions League coverage, and what analysis are we getting? It's like watching paint dry. Enjoy the Bundesliga on TV for a few more months. I'll subscribe to ESPN Plus, but I'll miss Fox's coverage. 7 games on Fox TV on the weekend versus 0 on ESPN. Think about it. Yeah, it's and I think Azer is definitely not in the crowd of people that are positive about ESPN Plus as a whole. But to me, you need the different types of fans. Some fans will tune in, right at kickoff, and as soon as the full-time whistle is done, they're gone. But for me, one of the reasons that the Premier League is so popular in the United States has been the shoulder programming, has been the effort on discussing this, on discussing the teams, the players, the stories. And the storytelling aspect is something that happens that you don't get with, having the game just on ESPN Plus without any programming beside it. Now, with ESPN Plus, with the Bundesliga, when it does happen, we'll have to wait and see if we do get any of that. But there is an advantage, yes, to having it on television, but there's a bigger advantage to having that storytelling aspect. And yes, we're not getting that with Fox, based on, for the most part, kind of the inconsistent coverage of the Bundesliga. But who's to say we're not going to get that with the Bundesliga on ESPN Plus? Maybe we'll get that.
Yeah, I'm not sure what we're going to get. I am skeptical. I have to admit that, and I'm probably more in your camp, Azer, than I am in the camp that says, "Oh, this is a great move." But we'll see. There have been some indications ESPN might kind of flip the switch and do more for the Bundesliga than they're doing for Serie A. Mm-hmm. But seeing how they've covered Serie A, I think Serie A is probably getting less in the way of shoulder coverage than it did when it was on BN. So that would be, although it wasn't great on BN. I mean, BN was focused on La Liga and PSG more than anything Serie A related. But I think we'll have to wait and see. But I'm skeptical.
Yeah, and even when Serie A was on beIN Sports, I can't remember any good analysis. I can't remember any thought-provoking analytical discussions of that. So just having shoulder programming or having studio talent, just having it is not enough. You mean that's not going to make any difference. Just having it is not going to cure things and resolve or help things. You have to have some quality, put a commitment in there, have some quality analysis.
I think in general, I mean, there's not the BN thing. Now we're many years beyond that, but when you stack your analysis team, you stack your commentary team based on having La Liga, there tends to be at times a contempt for Serie A because the styles are so different. And people, we just getting back to that whole league discussion, people who love La Liga will tell you almost as like a standard talking point how boring Serie A is. And people who are Serie A fans will almost as a standard talking point at times tell you how La Liga is not tactical enough for them. Mm-hmm. So those two leagues in particular, I've noticed there's a lot of tension between the supporters of those leagues. Yeah. So them being on the same network and that network emphasizing one of those leagues over the other caused bad coverage. But the point is ESPN Plus has not done anything necessarily to elevate that coverage, and that's a concern with the Bundesliga, where the coverage starts at a higher place with the way Fox has covered the league the last 5 seasons.
And one more thing about beIN Sports is that it's not good to have two of your biggest properties competing against each other. So, for example, when they had La Liga, I mean, they have La Liga. When they had Serie A rights, the kickoff times are competing with La Liga for the most part. So, La Liga is always going to get the priority, and then as a result, a lot of those Serie A games, I think a lot of them were on beIN Sports Connect. I mean, a lot of them weren't even on television, except for the early morning on Sundays. You'd have those games on. Same thing with Ligue 1, the French league, competing against La Liga as far as kickoff times, and beIN Sports as the rights holder to that. They're competing against themselves. So most of the games from the French First Division are on beIN Sports Connect because they don't have any bandwidth to show those on the beIN Sports English side because they're showing La Liga games. So looking at NBC, looking at the Premier League, I mean that's really the major product that they have. And looking at ESPN, the television side, as far as Major League Soccer, that's pretty much the major product that they have. ESPN Plus and the streaming platforms are a different story entirely. I think there you're going to pull in lots of different types of people from lots of different types of interests, and at the same time hope that they sign up for Disney Plus and some of the other services that they have. But it's a big problem to have if you have Ligue 1 and you're lost on a network that has good intentions, but you're not priority number 1, you're priority number 2. And in some weekends, there's more Turkish league soccer from the Turkish Super League on television on beIN Sports than there is the French league. So we want you to have your say. You can always reach us via email through web@worldsoccertalk.com, as well as facebook.com/worldsoccertalk, and on Twitter @worldsoccertalk. Plus, of course, you can post your comments on worldsoccertalk.com. So let us know what questions you have, what opinions you'd like to share, whether it's about streaming or production or commentators or you name it. And kind of the way that our viewing experience is changing. Every week we're bringing you the latest news about, the move to cord cutting or CBS in this case, acquiring some of the rights to the NWSL to have those games on over the air, CBS, which is a big move. But this world is continuing to change. So let us know what you'd like to find out from us. And thank you for listening. Kartik, before we go ahead and close out the show, something a little bit different. I didn't give you a heads up on this one, but hopefully you have something in mind here. But heading into the next week of football, is there one match that stands out as your must-see?
Yeah, Chris, I think it's pretty obvious for me. I think the Bayern RB Leipzig match on Sunday, top of the table class in the Bundesliga, 1 and 2 in the Bundesliga, is the match to watch this weekend. Although there are some other good matches, and keep in mind we're in a winter break for the Premier League, so there will be no 3 p.m. kickoffs these next 2 weekends in the Premier League. The winter break is kind of funny because you will have Premier League games throughout it, but everybody gets a week off is basically, and so 2 weeks between matches. That is this gives you a chance at that 10 a.m. Eastern time, 3 p.m. kickoff UK time to maybe watch some other leagues. So watch the Championship, watch the Bundesliga. If there's a Serie A match, watch that. Possibly watch a match from the Dutch League or the Portuguese League if you want to find those online on ESPN Plus and other places. So Fubo, etc. I think that this is a good opportunity maybe for Premier League fans to broaden their horizons. But one game I would definitely watch is Munich, is Bayern and RB Leipzig on Sunday.
All right, yeah, and that one's on FS2. All right, well, thank you for listening. You can get a new episode of the World Soccer Talk podcast every Thursday. Every episode is released on SoundCloud, Spotify, Pandora, YouTube, Stitcher, iTunes, TuneIn, Audio Boom, Overcast, and worldsoccertalk.com. If you like the show, share it with your friends on social media and give us a review on iTunes.
Enjoy your football.